Welcome to the PIC Report Update. I'm Joe Macbeth. Today we're going to be talking about the market constraints and information around passives, memory, and resin. It's going to be really good information. I hope you stick around. Today we have the opportunity to sit down with two of the leaders in our supply chain, especially around commodity management and supplier management, to talk about what's going on in the market and what's driving the situation that many of us are feeling some pain from. Today we have Ahmed El-Ghioschi, who's responsible for our resin, and we have Graham Scott, who's actually responsible for our global commodity management team as a whole. Graham, let's start with you. You know, we've seen market conditions that are tight in the past, but this feels a bit different. What's going on in the market right now?
From a passives perspective, we probably haven't seen anything like this since 1999. And go back to the tantalum allocation, and you and I lived and died through that process. And it's a little different to that. At that point in time, the tantalum content within PCs was really driving the demand. There wasn't really too many other huge growth markets at that time. It was all coming out of PC. Today, when we look at passives and we look at the constraints that we face, it's very broad. It's across multiple commodities, whether it's resistors, capacitors, even now some inductors we have some issues with. But it's really this explosion of growth of electronic components within products such as automotive, smartphones, and just really generally, if you think about IoT, all these new connected devices that in the past didn't really have electronic content. So it's this explosion of growth with additional content that's really driving it from the demand side. But from the supply side, we're also seeing a lot of the suppliers really looking at their portfolio and making bets on where they're going to invest and also where they're going to divest. So where they're divesting, obviously there's a reduction in capacity and output, and that's also a major factor in what we're seeing as far as the supply constraints today.
These are products that have lived for 20 years plus. Yeah. What's really, from the supplier's view, what are they really trying to accomplish here?
Clearly, there's a huge market out there for smartphones. Some of these smartphones now have 1,000 capacitors in them, for example. And you think about the overall capacitor market, and just think about that demand for a second. That's 50% of the market. There's 3 trillion PCs manufactured per year. 1,000 PCs times 1.5 billion smartphones is 1.5 trillion MLCC. So that's a huge player, and the smartphone manufacturers are looking to miniaturize all the time as they look to expand the feature set within their smartphones. So that drive of miniaturization is huge. On the other side of things, we've got a huge growth in automotive electronic content. We think about a standard combustion engine car today. It's probably got 2,000 to 3,000 electronic components. You think about an electric vehicle, and we're now thinking of 12, 13, 14,000 ceramic capacitors alone, just on capacitors. So, huge growth in content. So the suppliers are looking at miniaturization. They're looking at things like high reliability for the automotive space, things like soft terminations or flexible terminations that are required to meet the vibration requirements.
So in general, they're driving demand into a space that they want to invest, because that's really the future, and their legacy product is going to be the target.
Yeah, and that's probably the biggest challenge we have today, is that many of the products that we're manufacturing for our customers are still using technology that it's hard to fathom, but is 20 years old. You think of 0402 capacitors and resistors. That probably came out just prior to tantalum allocation the last time, so it was like 1997, 96, round about there. And that product now is 20 years old. Right. And we're still designing bills of materials and products with those components designed in. And unless we move up that technology curve and move to smaller components, then this problem is only going to get worse.
We've talked in the past about lead time change. What are we really seeing as far as scale of the issue?
Many of the suppliers are quoting lead times out beyond 6 months, approaching a year. In resistors, we actually see, in some cases, manufacturers quoting close to 2 years on specific products within their portfolio. However, lead time's becoming, I don't want to say less of an issue, but it's almost becoming an irrelevance because they're looking at allocation. And when you're in an allocation mode, lead time isn't as important. Basically, they're telling you how much of your demand they can support. What we see from especially the Japanese suppliers at the moment is a review of our backlog from 2016 and them telling us for 2018 what they're going to support based on that booked backlog back in 2016. That's the extent of the problem we have at the moment. So any new products that are being launched into the market, especially with the older technologies, are going to be very, very difficult to support.
20 years ago, we were probably buying from 4 or 5 guys max. There's hundreds of capacitor suppliers in the world. So what does the market look like today? Who are we dealing with? And how do we manage that relationship?
Yeah, so from a ceramic capacitor perspective, there's probably 10 guys that are driving 90+% of the market. Again, if you look at where they're making their investments and the markets that they want to play in, you can kind of look at it in 3 different ways. There's those that are technology focused, they're focused on miniaturization of components, they're looking to support the smartphone demand. We also have another area where they're more focused on automotive. So they're focused on supporting that high reliability product. And then the third area is basically the guys that are left to catch the volume of commercial grade parts that neither of these 2 categories want to support. So you've got these 3 distinct buckets. You know, the American supply base really focused on automotive, with a couple of the Japanese suppliers. You've got Japanese and Korean, again, focus more on the miniaturization, and then the Taiwanese are trying to support the fallout from both. And that's kind of how I would look at it.
So what are we watching? You know, this has been going on for some period of time. Everyone's trying to figure out when it will end, what they have to do to survive the period and how long the period is. What are we looking at to help us understand when the changes will take place?
We're spending more time in front of the suppliers. We're watching our demand from our customers, and you know, we play in those major markets that are attractive to the suppliers. So, you know, as we get line of sight to business and we hear what's going on as far as demand spikes, we're talking to the suppliers quickly. We're transmitting our forecasts as regularly as we can, and updating them as quickly as we can. So even before we've actually got POs from customers, we're sitting down and talking to the supply base about the business that's coming in. So because of that broad view of the market and the various market sectors that we play in, it's given us the ability to kind of point to what's going to change or what's not going to change in this case. Because one of the things that we see is that demand is actually pretty stable. There's no major spike in any of the markets. They're all doing pretty well. But there's not one particular demand spike coming from a market sector. It's all this content growth that's really driving it, which is why we don't necessarily see a short-term fix here. It's not something that's just going to flip like it did back in 1999 with tantalums, where all of a sudden there was a glut and pricing crashed and support was provided by the manufacturer. So I don't see it turning as quickly as it did back then.
I don't either, and I really don't want that same scenario. I mean, that was a really tough time as people just to live through, let alone as a supply base. Let's carry that thought a little bit further. You know, when we talk about caps, I find it amazing that once again, resistors of all things are now tight.
Right.
Is it the same problem that we're dealing with there?
Yeah, pretty much, Joe. It's miniaturization again. It's a little less complex because there's probably less facets involved, but on resistors, you've got a similar kind of situation happening where the increased content, the defocus of technology means that certain suppliers are left really carrying the can for the others. And you know, we see that today with a couple of the resistor suppliers who are renowned for staying in the market longer than perhaps other manufacturers. And you know, they're taking the heat for other people's decisions on divesting from areas of the business. So, you know, they just don't have the capacity to support not just the demand that they're getting from their customers, but the demand that they're now picking up from our customers that can't use their previous source of resistors.
So Graham, those two commodities we talked about, doesn't look like anything in the short run is going to change the condition we're in. There are some other things that are issues, and one of them in particular is memory.
So, in the memory space, it's probably been a more constrained market for a little bit longer than passives. It's typically an indicator of what's going to happen in the broader market anyway, as we both know. You think about NAND and a smartphone again, the doubling of capacity almost every new release drives additional bits that are required for those smartphones. The system memory's increasing. Most of the new models have gone from 2 gig to 4 gig, which again increases demand on the market. You've got technology conversions happening both in NAND flash and in DRAM. In NAND flash, they're going to 3D NAND, and DRAM, you're moving from DDR3 to DDR4, DDR5 coming along next. So all of these things, very similar to passives, where you've got this technology conversion and increased content. And then you've got areas where suppliers are divesting as well. And NOR flash, for example, seems to be probably our most constrained product at the moment. Our commodity managers for memory are really struggling at the moment to get supply for the demand that we have for NOR flash. We're having to drop down a tier to try and find suppliers to support that business.
So again, no short answer on this, but it looks like you're seeing some things that are showing, mid next year we could be in a better position.
I would say that the outlook for memory is slightly better than passives. The indicators show that, again, using the third parties and using some of the information that we have, that we should see some easing of supply in that kind of latter part of the first half of 2018. With passives, there is no line of sight to that improvement. So, from that perspective, yes, memory is looking a little better from an outlook perspective, but it's still going to be a challenge for the next few months.
Let's spend a little time talking about resin, Ahmed. Over the last year, we've had a lot happen in that market. I don't think people are all in tune with some of the things that have happened. Can you share what's gone on in the market over the last year or so?
A lot of people think that resin is a very global, it's run by these big players. It's these large organizations, and while that's true, these organizations are large. It's very regional resin supply base. You have the North American supply, the Asian supply, Asia Pacific, and the European, Middle Eastern supply. And that really comes down to feedstocks, which are kind of the building blocks of resin. So you have, in certain regions, more abundance of, say, natural gas or oil or other things like that. That's one of the reasons why it's very regionalized and not as global as people think of it. Moving those feedstocks, gases, is not an easy thing to do across an ocean. So you find that they're typically build their facilities and their plants localized to where the natural resources are. And all of the suppliers stick to a certain region. Another thing, too, that dictates the market is government regulation. So, for example, shale gas. Shale gas is banned in certain parts of Europe. However, it's one of the processes we use here in North America, and it's a very advantageous from a price point. Natural gas is very stable. It's a market that is not volatile like oil. So you find good margins, good price. Manufacturers like to use that. So
when you think of it as a regional supply chain, global but regional, do we see different products in different parts of the world?
So what we typically see is the same products manufactured in different ways. So for example, in North America, natural gas is a big, one of the major feedstocks and energy sources used to create resin in North America. In the Middle East, you'll find that oil-based is typically the predominant source. So depending on those energy markets, you'll find the prices fluctuate. Products, though, however, they're pretty much manufactured the same materials across globally. It's the price margins, the markets that dictate what is more favorable to import and export materials.
Are you seeing any changes in certain commodities in the resin space, advancing, things that we should look for going forward in this space, and certain resins falling off the map?
So in your commodity space, which is 95% of the resin market, you have polypropylene, polyethylene, PP, PE. Those are about half of the resin market. And then in the specialty space, you have primarily polycarbonate and ABS that make up the 5% remaining. So it's heavily weighted on the commodity resins. And what we're seeing happening right now, there's a large shift in the Asia Pacific region, primarily in China and India. There is a rise in middle class consumers. There is a increase in the need for consumer packaging and goods. So what you're seeing is, these resin producers are looking 20 years in advance. They've already started building polyethylene plants in the U.S. using that shale gas, the advantage they have over oil, to capacitize for that influx that's expected to happen in the mid-2020s. So what we're going to have in the next few years is an oversupply of polyethylene. It's going to make it very competitive for us. It's going to bring prices down until that demand picks back up as the populations in the APAC region grows.
What industries, for the most part, consumer packaging, is that the industry that'll be most affected by that?
For the polyethylene, yes. Basically, your food packaging, in general, all consumer packaging, detergent bottles, water bottles, diapers, a lot of that industry, plastic bags, film and sheet, all of that is dictated with the polyethylene, polypropylene markets, primarily polyethylene. And then you have, there's some other industries that use it, not as predominantly. There's construction, there's automotive, but those you'll find in the specialty space. Automotive and medical tend to be the drivers of the industry, whereas consumer packaging tends to be the driver in the commodity space.
Makes a lot of sense. We started by saying, it's been a tough year. So what happened over the last year, and is it something that we're going to see in the future, and how do you manage the situations that we have had?
There's always some disruption, some activity happening in the resin market. And I think this year we were plagued by two very significant issues. There was a large PC producer who transitioned their ERP system, and as a result, we had shutdowns and supply gaps created. This has been now a year since we've been dealing with this issue. The other issue that happened was Hurricane Harvey. Many people are familiar with that hit the Houston area, caused severe flooding in the area, shut down a lot of refineries, a lot of rigs, oil rigs, feedstocks, building blocks for resins, resin manufacturing, shut down for days and weeks. Now, there's ripple effects because of that. When you had the ERP transition, your polycarbonate was constrained here in the US, but that also put a constraint globally in China and other regions. So globally, there's been a PC constraint as a result. Now, 1 year later, I'd say we're about 90% of where we need to be fully recovered. And the goal is by the end of this year, we should start to see that kind of stabilize and be hopefully behind us. On the Harvey situation, what we saw is polyethylene and polypropylene primarily were affected. Polyethylene, the Chevron CP Chem plant in Cedar Bayou, that shut down for months because of flooding. It just opened this month. They just restarted production, and that has eased a bit of that polyethylene constraint that we were seeing. However, to make up the backlog, it does take some time. And with the additional capacity coming online next year, that'll help ease that quicker. But at the moment, polyethylene and polycarbonate will tend to be our two most constrained materials going into 2018.
It seems like when we look at our customers' demand, in the large majority of the cases, everything is single source with one resin and one supplier. What drives that, and is that the way that we have to live our life going forward?
So traditionally, yeah, we pick a resin, we stick with it, we like it, and we don't change. In reality, though, what I've seen is it's not a matter of if something will happen, it's a matter of when something will happen. For years, looking back at history and talking to experts who've been managing resin for over 30 years, there is always going to be a disruption. You have to stay ahead of that. You have to plan for that. Now, dual sourcing is challenging in resin because of that sole source nature. You go up the value chain, you're dealing with very sole source and single source situations at the oil head and natural gas extraction point. So how do you break that chain? And that when we provide an alternate solution, we look at alternate resins, we are not just looking at a different material, but a regionally different material, a value chain that breaks that up so that we're not just having another material, but we're actually really de-risking our supply chain.
So as we look at it today, the trauma that we endured last year seems to be behind us. Obviously, we're always looking to see what's next. Is there anything as far as general capacity that's a constraint out there?
PC and PE will continue to be constrained. I think there's going to be a significant improvement in the polyethylene PE market. We're going to see an overcapacity. This is something we could take advantage of. If we have material selection options, polyethylene will be low priced for a few years to come till demand picks back up. For polycarbonate or polycarbon, we're going to see Covestro is adding additional capacity in their Shanghai facility. So they went from 200,000 metric tons to 400,000 this past October, and they're adding an additional 200,000, which will make them the largest PC, globally, PC manufacturer. And I suspect the competition will also work to keep up with that. And what's driving that is really automotive industry. We're going to see a lot of that. Medical industry, as we move from more metals to plastic solutions, that's really going to drive that. And an interesting thing too, I've seen, just read about this this week, the compounding industry across the board. These are compounders who take base materials, polyethylene, polypropylene, they add additives, colors, other mixtures, and create specialty custom materials. They've all across the board have seen increases in their business, high single digits to double digits. So there's a drive to using more compounded materials, driven again by the automotive industry. As you see autonomous vehicles coming up, that's going to really push things even further, and I suspect that the industry will react to that and start adding more capacity and debottlenecking efforts and other things to bring up supply.
Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel, and if you want further information, download the PIC report at jabil.com.